And you are live.
Okay, thank you. I will call our August 11th, 2020 CSAC meeting to order. First topic would be public comments on items not on the agenda. I'm assuming no one has joined us. And I'm assuming, unless I hear from Nick, that no one sent anything to the city. Okay. So do I have a motion or any comments on the approval of our meeting minutes from our last meeting?
I first.
What's that?
So I first amend.
Okay, so you'll make a motion to approve.
Motion,
Second?
Yeah.
Second.
Okay, that was Jim. Thanks, Jim. Okay, so we vote. I'm sorry, do we vote? Do I call for each person or do we just raise our hand? What would you?
I think raising your hand would probably be perfectly fine.
Okay, thank you. So if you're in favor of approving the minutes, please raise your hand. Anyone opposed? The meetings are thus approved. Okay, Nick, I will turn over to you then for the PowerPoint presentation.
Thank you, Steve. Good evening, members of the commission. If you recall, we have been working on the stormwater management topic here for probably close to a year now. And tonight we have with us Paul Hammersmith. He is the Director of Engineering for the City of Dublin. We have Michael Hendershot, who is also a member of his team. And you've heard from Michael throughout these presentations at some of our previous meetings. Joining us tonight, who you have not heard from, will be Matt Stifler, who is our Director of Finance. And lastly, the individual who you will receive our presentation from tonight will be an intern in our Office of the City Manager, Kirby Dirth. He has done a significant amount of the research that you all have received previous to this meeting around some of the funding options for the stormwater management that we have been discussing. So just as a quick summary before we jump into the presentation, if you recall, the Commission's previous recommendation was that we assume the maintenance, or the city assumes the maintenance of 46 stormwater retention basins that are currently publicly owned but privately maintained. The caveat that was with that recommendation was that City Council consider a funding mechanism for that in order to take over that ongoing maintenance year over year. Council, if you recall, had some significant discussion around that topic. They referred it back to this commission to explore some creative options, potential options that might exist to fund the ongoing maintenance of these 46 basins. So we've taken the last couple of months to do some research around that, see what is out there within the state of Ohio, beyond the state of Ohio, throughout the country, see if we can't come up with some creative options for you all to consider for a recommendation back to City Council. So with that being said, does anyone have any questions for myself before we jump into the presentation? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share our presentation here in just a moment, and then I will hand it off to Kirby for the presentation.
Good evening, Commission members. My name is Kirby Dirth, and I'm a City Management Intern in the Office of the City Manager and a student at The Ohio State University. I've had the privilege to work beside Nick, Paul, and Matt to bring you this presentation this evening. To best understand what funding options are available to the city should we absorb maintenance responsibility of these 46 basins, staff utilized the EPA best practices crafted by the National Association of Flood and Stormwater Management Agencies to develop options for moving forward. The first EPA best practice is general revenue appropriations. General revenue appropriations are the most common source of stormwater management funding. This is largely due to collection and disbursement systems associated with taxes being well established and familiar to residents. Under this model, stormwater project management responsibilities and funding are embedded within current operational work units. Another option is to establish plan review, development inspection, and special user fees. Most local, county, and state governmental entities can establish and collect fees and other charges to obtain operating funds for programs and services. Theoretically, a variety of special user fees could be included under the scope of a stormwater utility or adopted separately to support regulatory measures in project management. Special fees are also always associated with a regulatory function. This function could be directly or indirectly linked to stormwater management projects. Theoretically, we could also establish a special assessment or improvement district. The assessment improvement funding model appropriates costs to the properties that directly require or benefit from the provision of service or maintenance. This does not commonly provide comprehensive funding for stormwater management in a community, but can ensure that the new stormwater infrastructure is properly inspected and supported, while special improvement districts, or SIDs, revenues subsidize the maintenance or improvement of assets. To create a SID, property owners within the proposed area petition local government for the creation of the SID and the development of plans for public improvements and public services that benefit the area. Funds are then generated from special improvement district specific fees or taxes. We also could implement a number of impact fees. These are a development-based funding model. Costs are applied to developers to fund publicly owned and operated off-site stormwater services and infrastructure improvements. They are based on the cost of mitigating development impacts of individual developments by building public off-site improvements where impacts can't be solved on-site. Impact fees are typically limited to situations in which impact of a new development on existing infrastructure system is measurable, defined to a geographic location, and quantifiable in terms of capital investment. This type of fee is very much development-based and may not be relevant for our situation. Municipalities can also utilize bonds for capital improvements. Bonds are typically utilized to fund infrastructure improvement projects. They do not serve as a revenue source for routine maintenance, but the chief advantage of bonding is that it allows for expenditures that far exceed current revenues and resources. They're typically utilized for capital improvements and for planning far into the future. We also could implement in lieu of construction fees. In lieu of construction fees are usually a substitute for requiring on-site solutions such as detention storage. They may be used even in instances when an on-site system would work, but an off-site regional facility is preferable. The most significant disadvantage of in lieu of construction fees is that they rarely generate sufficient revenue to fund maintenance. It is also a development-related fee similar to the impact fees. So therefore, it may not be entirely relevant to our current situation. Another strategy that the EPA presents is capitalization recovery. This is most often intended to recover a fair share of prior public investment in infrastructure installed to accommodate future development. So this is commonly related to capital costs, and it is known as the latecomer fee, and is associated with a new development that is moving into an area that already has stormwater infrastructure installed. Again, this is likely not relevant to our situation, but a tool in the toolbox. And then lastly, we have stormwater utilities. These fees are generally calculated based off of the amount of impervious area on a property, resulting in larger commercial properties paying more than smaller residential households. The stormwater utility format provides a predictable and dependable amount of annual revenue dedicated to the implementation of stormwater management. This allows for orderly implementation of stormwater management strategies moving forward. Annually, Western Kentucky University conducts a utility survey with the goal of developing a national stormwater utility inventory. In 2020, Western Kentucky University identified over 1,800 stormwater utilities nationwide. Specifically in Ohio, there are 116 stormwater utilities. Typical monthly rates are dependent on the ERU, which is an equivalent residential unit. The statewide median monthly rate is $3.50 per ERU. The average monthly utility rate for the state is $3.70. The highest monthly fee is $13 per ERU, and the lowest was 25 cents per ERU. The average population of a community utilizing a stormwater utility model in the state of Ohio is just over 66,000 people, which is relatively similar to our size as a community. The average equivalent residential unit was just around 3,000, which is similar to what communities across Central Ohio use. In Central Ohio, there are 13 stormwater utilities in total. Newark is the most expensive at $6.50 per ERU. Groveport is the least expensive at $2, and typical ERUs span from 2,000 to 3,000 square feet. Typical monthly fees also come in around $2 to $3, so similar to the statewide average. We also, as staff, looked into multiple municipal examples, one of which was Bowling Green, Kentucky, with a population of 68,000. They're similar in size, and their issue is somewhat related to ours. Bowling Green has a large number of private stormwater retention basins in need of maintenance. The private needs for assistance represent a maintenance burden that cannot feasibly shift to the public. So the municipality established a grant program that allows private basins in need of financial assistance to be nominated for public assistance by residents for one-time public funds assisted maintenance during an annually announced application period. Newton, Massachusetts, around 90,000 population, sought to generate a stable and adequate source of funding to pay for capital improvements, staff, and other stormwater management expenses related to local needs and federal mandates from the EPA. Newton's stormwater fee is a set charge based on whether a property is residential or non-residential, and the city does offer a discounted fee for senior residents. This case highlights the flexibility of stormwater utility programs. Culver City uses parcel taxes rather than a stormwater utility fee to link property ownership and associated runoff generation to the cost of stormwater services. One advantage of the parcel tax is that the revenue can be used for project capital or maintenance costs. Under their parcel tax structure, single-family property owners pay $99 annually, multifamily property owners pay $69 per dwelling unit, and non-residential customers pay a little over $1,000 annually. Fresno, California in 1956 established the Fresno Metropolitan Flood Control District as a special district to help manage 165 stormwater retention basins and other surface water flows in the Fresno-Clovis region and the surrounding agricultural area. To ensure that stormwater basins are installed as the community expands, the district coordinates with land use planners and land developers to oversee proper and effective construction. To cover construction and land acquisition costs of these basins, the flood control district charges developers a one-time fee that is increased regularly to keep pace with the rising costs of materials, labor, and land in the area. Although this is development heavy, which may not be entirely relevant to our community, it showcases how local governments organize themselves to manage stormwater concerns across jurisdictions. So in moving forward, throughout several meetings, staff discussed the costs and benefits associated with a number of potential models. In doing so, we have identified 6 potential models for moving forward and have displayed the pros and cons related to each respective option. The first of which is to assume maintenance funded through the Capital Improvements Fund. With 25% of the city's 2% income tax revenue funding the Capital Improvements Fund, this potential revenue source is already generally understood and accepted by residents and businesses alike. The funding stream and operational work units are already in place, and the CIP is generally stable from year to year. However, stormwater management projects have historically struggled to compete for funding against other priority projects that receive funding through the CIP. Additionally, the sources of CIP revenues are generally indirectly related to stormwater management needs. meaning stormwater management is not generally viewed as an economic development investment or a revenue generating service such as water and sewer utilities, and therefore could be overlooked in budgetary discussions moving forward. This option does not establish any new revenue streams, and we would ultimately be taking on the maintenance using funds from the CIP. And now we will identify two options that could generate supplemental funding for a stormwater management project moving forward. The first of which is to assume maintenance and establish a special improvement district or a SID. Some of the pros: SIDs are capable of generating revenue that can adequately fund routine maintenance of stormwater basins. However, this is largely dependent on the rate of fees and taxes that are established for the SID. SIDs ensure that those that directly benefit from services are the ones who pay for them, and they can also be utilized for a number of maintenance activities, including sidewalks, roads, flood control channels, dikes, or stormwater basins. Some of the cons: ultimately, if the current neighborhood organizations are unable to generate sufficient revenues to fund the maintenance of stormwater basins, a SID is likely to achieve the same outcome. Government must pay prevailing wage, resulting in SID-related fees or taxes likely being higher than current HOA fees. To establish a SID, Ohio law requires 60% of front footage owners or 75% of all property owners in the SID to sign a petition. Therefore, a significant number of residents within the community would be required to support raising fees for a SID to be established. We could also assume maintenance using development fees and impact fees to supplement the costs associated with the maintenance. Some of the pros: it ultimately relieves residents, taxpayers, and utility ratepayers of the financial burden associated with taking responsibility for these basins, and special fees support the regulatory functions of local government. However, special fees are typically only generating adequate revenue streams in high growth communities. In developed communities such as our own, development fees serve to generate just supplementary funding, and it may not be enough to fund the program at very high levels. We could also establish a stormwater utility. Stormwater utility fees establish a dedicated user fee driven revenue stream that is capable of covering costs associated with stormwater management costs citywide. This revenue stream is typically stable, allowing public officials to conduct long-term capital improvement planning with reasonable assurance of the future. Fees are apportioned based off of standardized units or ERUs of impervious land, resulting in equality in treatment. Credit and grant programs can be established to reduce fiscal liability for targeted groups such as senior citizens. Some of the cons associated with a stormwater utility, the greatest of which is the buy-in that is necessary from the public. Also, there's a significant administrative burden implementation creates. User fees are incredibly visible to the public and can be viewed as new taxes. And the cost of implementing a stormwater utility is a function of the number of accounts, financial and engineering analysis requirements, establishing a billing department, and the creation of relevant information systems. These requirements result in a need for current work units to expand their operational capacity, resulting in new spending on staff. Additionally, those properties with large impervious areas are typically members of the commercial business community. Many of these businesses already operate a privately owned, privately operated stormwater management asset due to the city requirements. Under a stormwater utility, businesses would shoulder more of the burden than residential units, while also being required to upkeep their privately owned assets. Another option that we identified is the phased in or opt-in approach. Just a little bit of background. Theoretically, the city could establish a program that allows for HOAs to shift the cost of some or all the maintenance of a stormwater basin to the city in an incremental manner. So some of the pros associated with this option are that the city could utilize this approach to fund certain maintenance activities to reduce the burden of HOAs in the short run. The incremental nature of the program would allow for future planning and budgeting. This would also grant the city time to create predictable revenue streams before taking on majority of the maintenance responsibility. Some of the cons associated with this option: HOAs are still on the hook for some costs in the short run, and there are no new revenue streams associated with this project. Another option that we have is a grant program. The city could establish a grant program that could selectively subsidize the maintenance of publicly owned, privately maintained stormwater basins. This program could function similarly to the aforementioned Bowling Green program. Such a program would be highly customizable, with staff selecting certain maintenance activities that could qualify for matching public grants. Additionally, granting assistance maintains HOA responsibility, so it would not be transferred to the city. A program similar to the Bowling Green model would require little administrative burden with a lower cost to the city compared to other options. Some of the cons associated with this option: the program would not create any new funding mechanisms, and grants may not be sufficient relief to the HOAs. And lastly, we could do nothing. There are several stormwater basins throughout the city that are privately owned and maintained that would not benefit from a program aimed directly at stormwater basins maintained by HOAs. This could generate questions of fairness from affected stakeholders. The only reason the city owns these basins is to reduce the property tax burden on HOAs. If it wasn't for this assistance, these stormwater basins would be classified as privately owned, privately maintained basins. Some of the pros of this option: there would not be any financial burden, and we wouldn't be establishing a precedent of taking on maintenance responsibilities. Internally, we had a discussion: what happens when the city takes responsibility for the upkeep of this asset? What's the next ask moving forward? And have we established a precedent for doing so? A con associated with this option is that problems with these stormwater basins will persist if we do not help. This could result in the degradation of the city's stormwater system due to a lack of maintenance, which could ultimately create unintended consequences that the city would need to mitigate moving forward.
All right. Thank you so much, Kirby. I think at this point, what would be a great sort of next step moving forward here, and is something that we did at our last meeting, which was the first time that we had all met virtually, is Steve, if you don't mind just sort of going down the list of each member and allowing them to either, share any thoughts that you have. You can ask any sort of specific questions that just sort of off the top of your head you want answered. Certainly perfectly fine to pass for now. I think once we just go one time around, then we can sort of enter into a discussion. I'll ask that staff just sort of have your video and audio off if you're not speaking. That way the commission members can see each other and try to sort of engage in discussion from that point. But any questions that you have, please feel free to ask, and please feel free to have as much discussion as you would like around this topic.
Okay, thank you, Nick, and thank you for that presentation, Kirby. I'm just going to go based on how I see the people on my screen. So there's no pros or no priorities here. So first one is Vivek. He's next to me on my screen. So any questions or comments as we go around the circle?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great presentation. Actually, this gives a lot of clarity for us, in terms of, the next step. Actually, the option I think he gave, try to ignore this. This would be nice if we can see the presentation, but it's fine. So the opt-in approach looks good, and the grant program looks good. And it's still, we may have to do a lot of discussion later on. And I think this is a great point to start for more discussion on this one. So as I said, Nick sent the whole program already. I couldn't go through everything. It just just a glance at, I think this presentation is helpful. It's a very good job for city. So I'll pass to the next one.
Okay, Jim. Any questions or
first of all,
comments?
thanks, Nick and Kirby. You really did a great job of gathering information and boiling it down. And I read even that 100-page document. There's a lot of information in there. So kudos to you on that. I like all the different, there are a lot of different options, very clear, easy. I have a pretty firm opinion on which direction I would prefer, but I think at this point, we're not really to discuss that. So I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Okay. Tom, you're next on my screen.
Yeah, I'm with Jim. I think I kind of have an opinion, but it's just, I just waiting to hear from finance department, so.
Okay. Gary, I don't mean to be sexist here, but the guy seems to be first on my screen.
Okay, that was a great presentation. Definitely consolidated a lot of the information that we had in previous documents. I think the first three approaches are probably something that wouldn't be applicable for what we're looking at right now. So the last three look like the most relevant to me in terms of the phased-in approach, a grant program, or do nothing. So I'm looking at those last three as probably the most likely ones that would be something that we need to definitely take a look at.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Dee, any questions or comments on the presentation?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Kirby. This was a nice summary of the package you sent earlier. I have actually a question about the grant program specifically. The Bowling Green program.
Can you speak up, please? I could hardly hear you.
Can you hear me?
Oh, now, yeah, definitely not better.
I have a question about the grant program. The Bowling Green program appeared to be like a one-off, so you could only get one grant and then you were on your own. I may have misread that. Is that something that did I misread that? And if I did, is there a process for reapplying for a grant if what you didn't succeed? That was one question. And the other was related to, again, related to that. How do we manage a grant program? Is it something that you have to actually publicly announce? Because that one was one that actually had caught my attention. How do you get the public involved in that?
Sure. So in my research, I did find that it is a one-off thing. It's an annual program and you have to apply for it. And there are certain criteria in which your application is judged. That doesn't mean that you can't apply every single year, but there is a committee that selects which basins will receive funding, and it is merit-based. So I would assume that if you apply for 3 years in a row and you're not managing your finances, that might be held against you. But yes, it is just an annual appropriation. And as for implementation, I would probably pass that question on to Matt, Paul, or Nick, because I did not come across that in my research.
Yeah, Dee, I won't dive too much into the weeds of any of the sort of grant things quite yet. But I think it's a good point of discussion and something that we could discuss if that was something that the commission wanted to head in the direction of. One of the things I should have done before I started our presentation as well is just what our goal here is to try to obviously summarize the large amount of research that we had sent along and shared with you all, and also just sort of provide you with what we see as some viable options and next steps moving forward. And depending upon where this discussion goes with the commission and where your all's interest is, we can probably potentially take back either 1 or 2 or 3 maybe directions of interest that you all have and bring back sort of more formulated recommendations for each of those and what those would look like at the next meeting. And so with the grant, I think you have a lot of flexibility, and we would have a lot of flexibility in how that would look. So obviously the Bowling Green is a great example, but we would not necessarily have to be exactly the same as that. So the city has some similar type of grant programs. So we have what we call the Beautify Your Neighborhood grant that's currently in place. It's a bucket of money for HOAs that they have access to for, I think, Matt, you can certainly jump in at any point and correct me if I make any wrong statement, but it's essentially there for smaller landscaping type projects to obviously beautify your neighborhood, improve the aesthetics or improve some different things that the neighborhood wants or needs to get done, but needs a little bit of financial help in making that happen, sooner rather than later. And so, we have some different things to work off of and pull from as examples that already exist within the city. Another really good example of something that council has done recently is they implemented a facade program for the historic district area. And so businesses that are in the historic district that are looking to do improvements on their facade could get matching grant dollars from the city. And it's a biannual cycle. So twice a year, council hears and approves from the different applicants and selects a couple of applicants to award the matching dollars to. Is that helpful?
Yes, it is. I was just thinking, and the same thing that that Jim mentioned or Gary mentioned, that some of them looked more appropriate to the city. I was just kind of honing in on one that sort of seemed reasonable. If we have programs that are similar to that, that helps in terms of implementing them. So that would be useful information to know with any of the choices we have. Do we have something in place now that would help give us a leg up on a particular way of dealing with it?
And then Dee, you asked about the one-off part of it with Bowling Green, and what we talked about was with the HOAs, one of the things they would struggle with is the major maintenance, like silt removal, that's going to be a large capital cost. So that was kind of our thought process with the grant program, that for that one-time major expense, and it really wouldn't be intended for kind of the routine maintenance of like outlet control structures, maybe cattail removal, that sort of thing. It really is for the major expenditure is where our thought was.
Okay, Elizabeth, any questions or comments? You're muted right now.
I know my mouse died and I just called for somebody to bring backup batteries because it died. As I recall, one of the questions we had was there aren't any formal policies currently for the city of Dublin to use as a guideline when these come to them. So if I look, only I think opt-in, I think number 3 gave an option to establish a policy. Would it make more sense to establish a policy before taking this on so there are guardrails for the city as opposed to a one-off?
Good question. I'll turn over to Nick, I guess, or Nick or Matt.
I think they go, for instance, the grant program, I think they would go hand in glove, that we would create the policy along with the grant program and like you say, kind of define the lanes that the grant would drive in, so to speak. So it was very clear what the intent of the grant program was and what would be eligible cost and what wouldn't be. But I think that's a very good point about the policy. I think it has to be established as part of that grant program.
And I wasn't speaking just for the grant program. I think the policy should be established regardless, so there aren't these confusions about who owns what and what can the city afford. Without those, the first thing someone's going to say is, where's your policy that says you can charge me for this or you don't have to charge me for this?
Yeah. So to that point, yeah, we would always look to, regardless of whatever direction the commission would choose to head in, and what recommendation you all would look to make to city council, we as staff, obviously on the administrative end, would make sure that there was a policy that went hand in hand with that recommendation and that decision. And so I think based on where you all see your conversation go tonight, when based on sort of what we hear from you, we can take that back and say, okay, we heard, these 2 options were what really interested you, and you want to know more about what that would look like for the city as a recommendation. We'll come back to you at the next meeting that we have with you and say, okay, here's what the policy would start to look like, and here's what that adjoining program would look like as well. So yeah, we would absolutely look to provide very specific sort of guidelines around anything that would be put in place, specifically when it comes to adopting or assuming additional maintenance in this case.
Okay, anything else, Elizabeth?
No, thank you.
Okay, this is Steve. I got just a couple questions, and they're just for my own information, maybe for the whole group. If when we talk about the SIDs, the special improvement districts, are we talking about for the 46 basins? Would we have to have 46 SIDs, or can we have one SID that includes all those 46 basins / HOAs?
Matt Stifler, can I defer to you at this point?
Sure. Yeah, I think we'd have to have 47 different basins because each of those different areas is,
46.
sorry, 47 different SIDs for each basin because each one of those areas is going to have a different shared cost for their stormwater needs. And the SID literature is pretty clear that you have to apportion the costs directly to the property's benefit. So it would not be fair, essentially, if you had, different size basins paying the same size costs. That would make it problematic.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Another question I have is just about ERUs. Is that calculated from property tax records, or do we? I mean, how does that work to actually figure out our ERU for City of Dublin?
This is Paul Hammersmith. There's different approaches to it, but the equivalent residential unit, if you go back and look at Kirby's research about the square footage,
Right.
The benchmark is kind of a typical residential lot and the size of that residential lot. So like a 60 by 120 lots, 7,200 square feet, like a 75 by 150 square foot lot, which is probably more typical of Dublin's, like 11,000 square feet. So you use that as your base, and then you go back through an engineering study, go out and look at all the commercial property and their impervious area to determine how much square footage they have of impervious area, and then how many ERUs they're going to be charged. So there's a lot of analysis that goes into both determining that ERU, and then once you determine it, what your utility fee is going to be.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, it goes back to the Word document. It was just a question I had. There was a document, there was a link from the Ohio EPA about best practices, or best management practices. And they actually had in there a couple pages of, what HOAs would be responsible for. Is that the type of thing we share with the HOAs that currently maintain their own basins, or do we have something different? Or do we have something documented that we give them that looks like what the BPM has documented?
I think we have referred them to that document in the past because it's a pretty good document.
Right.
It's pretty easy to understand. We don't have our own. We have our stormwater management codified ordinances, Chapter 53, but that's more prescriptive in terms of code requirements. I like the EPA document just from the practice side of it.
Okay. Okay. Well, those are my general questions. Thank you. So where do we go from here? I guess we should have our open discussion, and maybe there's some of these options we could just immediately eliminate and then focus on the critical few.
I'd like to get rid of number one, the SID. It seems like it's just going to be the same way as it is now, and it sounds like a lot of paperwork to set up 46 separate ones. It seems like it'd be a major headache and not really much of a benefit to the HOAs.
I mean, I'm personally good with that. Anybody think we should be looking at SIDs for the future?
No.
Three head shakes, no. It's out of there.
Yeah, everybody could unmute themselves, I believe, at this point of our commission. Okay.
And then item number two, the development impact fees. There's no new revenue there or anything like that. It's going to help out. So
Yeah, I was just actually, as a question I did write down, I was wondering for the city, is that something that we currently do for the new subdivisions, or is that something that it have to be retroactive, or not retroactive, but implemented for going forward, or what's the policy there? On
It really would just be implemented for new developments. I mean, that typically is how impact fees, development fees work. It's been debated in Ohio. There's been a lot of struggle with impact fees and challenges to impact fees, because you do have to demonstrate the true impact, and then how you determine that fee and what that cost is. So it's not as easy as it sounds on the surface. If it was, you would see a lot more communities, charging impact fees. I'll give you a good example is we do traffic impact studies where we then assess, impact fees, so to speak, and require developers to mitigate their impacts, like on intersections, our transportation network. That's all the result of a very detailed engineering study that looks at the before development condition and the after development condition, and what the incremental difference is on our transportation network, and then the cost of those improvements. That's very specific and very defined. That's rather difficult to do on a stormwater management system, to look at what a particular development's impact is going to be on your system. And that's why I think you really don't see it as a funding mechanism or a common funding mechanism in Ohio.
Okay. So does anyone of our commission have an issue if we table that, not table it, but discard that as an option?
No.
Okay. So we're getting 6 options. What about the stormwater utility option? And that's the big kahuna.
Sounds like a lot of bureaucracy.
A lot of work for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, if I go to the presentation, I know it would be, I think it says viewed as a new tax.
But I would like to have the discussion, just don't want it to be totally out, just in case, if we can find other approaches. I thought we'll have a discussion on it. I know it is, it's like more like a transparency in there. I know there may be some misunderstanding on the public, but I thought, more transparency there.
And the stormwater utility.
Right.
So do you want us to still consider it as an option, then, Vivek?
Yes, that's what I'm thinking.
Okay.
Seems to be something.
The only thing that popped out to me on a con basis on that one was, it seems like there's a lot of discussion within the city council about the administrative challenges right now, just completing things that need to be completed that are critical. If this option, which I'd like to, I'm willing to consider, also adds more to that from a really highly visible administrative burden, it seems like that would be a real challenge to move forward on. But
Okay. Well, we'll keep it still on the, I guess, as something to consider for our second round. So we go through the other options. We have the phased approach. Or opt-in approach.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think I wanted to keep it in there too, and opt-in. And
but to me, it seemed like the opt-in and the grant seem pretty similar. Except the grant seemed to be more, had more boundaries than the opt-in. Any comments about that, Paul?
Can the grant be designed to not have as many boundaries?
Could hardly hear you, Dee. I'm sorry.
Can the grant be designed to not have as many boundaries? We only have one example in here of how a grant works. Can grants work other than, and with more flexibility than what's in Bowling Greens?
Absolutely, and Commission members, if I may, I think the key distinction in the research between the two is that the phased and opt-in approach locks the city into helping these HOAs with their maintenance costs moving forward. It very much establishes a relationship in which we help them and we continually help them more or with a specific maintenance activity. Whereas the grant program has a little more flexibility. We could go the Bowling Green route and only do an annual appropriation. We could do a multi-year. I think there's more flexibility in that option.
Okay. Is everybody good if we put opt-in on the not pursue list? Or anybody want to keep it on? Or Vivek, did you say you wanted it in or not? I don't recall.
Actually, I really wanted in for the next round of discussions. We'll have more discussion on that.
I concur.
Okay. I'm just going through the list. Actually, the first one was absorbed the responsibility with no new dedicated funding, which is pretty similar to status, well, not status quo, but anybody have thoughts about that?
Which one are you
Which
talking
one,
about there,
Steve?
Steve?
Well, I guess I'm getting a little confused. I'm looking at slide 6. It has the options, and then
Right.
slide 7. I guess I'm assuming slide 7 is the same as number 1 on slide 6. Is that true, or did I misunderstand?
So Steve, you're asking about the option of assuming the maintenance and pulling from the capital improvement fund?
Well, I'm asking about if you go to the prior slide,
Right.
number
Correct.
1 says no new dedicated funding, so the city absorbs it. Is that
Yeah,
the
so-
same as page 7?
Yeah, so you're spot on. I mean, in essence, this option would be assuming the maintenance, right, of all 46 of these basins that we have been discussing and the commission has been discussing for your last several meetings, and simply just using the funds that already exist within our capital improvement program, and absorbing that maintenance and using the funding that is already in place. So in essence, you're not creating anything new. This would probably be just about your least creative. When we talk about innovative and creative options, this is probably the least so of those options. Because in essence, you're simply saying, okay, we believe it's important for the city to maintain these basins. We're going to take on the maintenance, and we are going to continue to pull all of that funding from the existing capital improvement program that already funds the maintenance.
Right. Okay, so I did understand it right. Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
I think for round 2, I think we should keep that one in for further discussion. So we talked about SIDS, we talked about development fees were out, SIDS was out. Stormwater utility, I'm sorry, my notes, I didn't write good notes. Did we say we're going to look at that further? The utility?
The stormwater utility?
Stormwater, yeah.
It looks as though other communities are using that. So there must be some benefit to it, or else they wouldn't be using it.
Okay, so we'll leave that one in. And then, the opt-in approach, I think Dee wanted to leave that one in. And then we have the do nothing.
Well, hey, Steve, just
Yeah.
on the grant one, can I ask a question about that one?
Yeah,
Relative to, like, what I've read was that grants are kind of challenging to get. So you have to prove a pretty good rationale for why you would deserve the dollars. And if it's matching, that means we do need to create more dollars to support our half of the grant. So would that dollar that we would pay come out of the, say, the general revenue fund? And so say we allocate a certain amount, we earmark, hey, we're not going to pay 50,000 on this, but we're going to give it to the storm management if we get the grant. Is that how that would play out?
Yeah, if it was structured similarly to how the city's current grant programs are structured, and I don't know why, at least initially, it wouldn't be. The grants are generally a 50% match. So the HOA would bring 50%, the city would pay 50%, And then there's generally a cap for like the Beautify Your Neighborhood grants. The city will pay up to $5,000, I think, in grant funding in any 3-year period, I believe. So we could analyze the needs out there and the types of projects that we're interested in funding and determine what an appropriate ceiling on that grant match would be, and then seek out those types of projects.
Oh, I see. Okay, so this is grant money coming right from the city's grant dollars that they have for other projects.
Exactly.
I see.
It would be the same funding source that all stormwater improvements would be paid out of, the income tax dollar allocation.
Yeah, Jim, and one other thing that I'll add, I mean, one way to think about it too is that in essence, it's a combination of option 1 and option 4, right? So you're absorbing maintenance, some level of maintenance of these basins without creating a new revenue source. And it's also a partial approach, right? So it's in essence, a phased approach as well. So if that helps you, I mean, if that helps me think about it sort of in that way. So
an HOA property owner would, if the grant goes through, would be happy because their fees would maybe cut in half. The city through this grant program would pay for the other half, and that's how that would play out possibly.
Yeah, that's a good example for sure.
And there'd be grants, individual grants for each HOA that would choose to move forward on this, or would it be a lump sum?
It
So
would
be. Sorry, go ahead, Nat.
Sorry, Nick. It would likely be a competitive process, as the current grant programs are. Generally, the asks are similar to the need or the amount allocated, but that's not always the case. That would depend on the ability, to fund, depending on the need out there. The part that is, appealing about a grant program is that one-time costs are always easier to fund than ongoing costs. So it's easier to fund a grant program that fixes a significant capital problem and delays assuming the maintenance, which is more of a recurring cost. The other thing that's kind of nice about a grant program is you can discontinue it. It's a grant program that's offered as revenues are available. If revenues aren't available, then it doesn't exist, and you have the opportunity to back away from that if you need to in the future potentially. So those are just some of the, cost advantages from my perspective of that type of funding source.
Just one last thing to play it out. If I was a property owner and I wanted to reduce my fee, I would write the grant to say the reason I want the city to select my HOA is because my fees are too high. And so would you please accept that as a rationale versus maybe a city store owner who has the back of their property that wants to be repainted and renovated for the beautification of the downtown Dublin area? Is that sort of like how you would kind of compare those two?
See, I guess as part of the grant program, I would probably think of it the opposite way. I would want to approve the grant application that we're sorry, we didn't know we needed all this. Our fees were too low, but when you give us this grant, we're going to promise that in the next 15 years, we'll set up a funding mechanism that solves this problem. So please give us the grant and save us from this catastrophe today, versus the HOA that says, we just want to lower fees. That, to me, I don't know, if I was a grant writer, when I'm reviewing that, I'd have two very different reactions. So, I hope that that's kind of how we would view it.
Very good, thanks.
I'd like to just finish the last one on the list, and that was do nothing. Anybody think we should consider that and basically keep status quo, or just discard that as an option to be further looked at?
I prefer to call it watchful waiting. I think the do nothing implies that we're just haven't taken the time and effort. But to me, this seems like more of a watchful waiting issue that I'm having a hard time figuring out what the dire need is for the city to take over these retention areas. So until it becomes something where people feel like there's flooding or there's quality of water issues or other things that are happening, I'd be hard pressed to fund it in any way. That's just my take.
I think the point of this, one of the points of having the city take over, is that we don't get to that point where we have, major issues, catastrophes, flooding, because all these basins feed into, a common rivers, and ideas that we all benefit from a good stormwater management. So
The city
I'd
has-
have to go back to I'm sorry, the presentation that was made by Maryland back in February that had all the, all the reasons why we believe we should have done, or take all the reasons we believe the city should absorb the maintenance of the 46 basins that they currently don't support. So do nothing or status quo, do you want to consider it, or? I
So
think,
I want to put it just a couple of points because from the past discussion, especially Tom can, tell that this is the option probably the city council wanted to prefer. Like when we turned back on the stormwater issue, when we presented to city council, that may be an option, maybe, I don't know, like after we work on this one, but this time, at least I wanted to tell the city council saying that the current, if you do nothing, it's kind of, I feel like imbalance on some residents paying more, some residents not. Like, the 46 publicly owned and privately, so they're either paying more or less in compared to the rest of them. So we need to, as a government, we need to be equal on everything. So at least, when you push this time, next time to the city council, we need to bring this to the point. If you do nothing, it is just, it's not equal for everybody. It's somebody's paying more on some instance. So which should be mitigated. So I think still, we can have as an option, but I thought we should have the least possibility on that one.
so you're saying keep it in scope,
Yeah.
to do nothing, or status quo, or
Right.
wishful watching. Okay. So I just have us dropping out too, the SID and the development impact fees. Before we go any further, did anyone have of our commission have any other thoughts on how we would fund this matter besides what the city has provided us? I just wanted to open that up. Yes, Jim?
Steve, in one of the documents Nick had sent, they referenced communities that would adopt these water basins. And I was thinking I can't remember which member on a committee that actually goes and mows their basin, their lawn. But somebody maintains their own retention basin. That would be another creative approach to say, hey, one way you can reduce your fees is we will train you to be able to maintain your area. That means if there's algae, like in our area right now, we've got algae that's covering half the pond. If I had appropriate rake that could extend out, I could form a team within my own neighborhood and say, let's go take care of that. The city can't handle it right now due to other activities, so let's do it ourselves. I'm just thinking there might be some motivated people within those HOAs that would be willing to reduce their fees by handling those projects on like a Saturday morning. They spend 2 hours on a Saturday morning just picking up debris or doing whatever's needed. So I just want to put that out as a suggestion.
Okay, good. And Jim, what subdivision do you live in?
We're in Wellington Place.
So I believe yours are, and Nick or someone, probably have to correct me, city owned and.
Yeah, Dublin maintains those.
Okay, yeah.
I talked to the one of the city guys. I asked him if I could go out and clean it up myself, and he said, yeah. He said that'd be no problem from a environmental standpoint. I would just rake it up, and then they would pick it up when it dries along the banks. So that's the major issue that we have with that particular pond.
Uh-huh. Huh.
So what have we knocked off this list that we don't want to talk about? Can we go through them and
What's that?
what have we actually knocked off of this list?
I had two on my notes. One was SIDS, and the other was the development and impact fees.
We haven't knocked off grants, right? Grants still on the.
Oh, yeah, I think grants, I mean, just hearing the discussion seems to be very popular. One is, you know, using the capital improvement fund, which was slide 7. Opt-in was, let me just go through.
Yeah, Steve, actually the SID and the development fees are actually item number 2. So I think we've only eliminated 1 so far.
Well, I was just going through the individual slides because I had individuals, right? There's like 6 on that list and 7 slides. Okay. I agree with Gary. So we eliminated number 2. That's fine if we want to use that list.
The phased approach is part of the opt-in is part of the phased approach.
What was the question?
Is the phased approach number 4? Was that part of opt-in is part of that one?
Yes, they
phased
are
and
together.
or opt-in. Right, that's slide 11.
Opt-in is the one that essentially ties the cities forever.
Dee, sorry, but you're getting very hard to hear.
So we're down to 1. Establish a stormwater utility. We're still going to maintain that at least for the next discussion.
Right. Is there any others that we want to remove from this list?
Grant and do nothing are on it, right?
Say again?
Grant and do nothing are left on it.
Right.
So we've eliminated 2 and 4, right?
I don't think we eliminated 4. I think I got a little confused with the difference. I know we talked about the difference between 4 and 5.
Yeah, so essentially the main difference, 5 is certainly a phased, similar to a phased approach, right?
Right.
So that would be an example of a phased approach. Kirby might be able to help me a little bit here in sort of separating out the 2, but essentially with the phased approach, without a grant program, you're essentially committing to taking on the maintenance of these basins for these HOAs permanently, right? So you are saying, or the city would be saying, we are going to take on this level of maintenance for these HOAs for the foreseeable future. A grant program is a little bit more refined in the sense that you're going to put some parameters around it. It's just one bucket of money, and it's more of an opt-in approach in the sense that communities and HOAs that actually have a need and find themselves confronted with a significant maintenance challenge are coming to the city to say, oh, we want to complete this application for this program because we've encountered this maintenance challenge that we simply did not see coming as it relates to our stormwater maintenance. Whereas, the phased approach, very specifically, we would be saying we're going to take on, I'm not great with all the stormwater terminology, but we'd essentially be committing to take on a very specific level of maintenance permanently with that approach. So I think if you all want to have some discussion around, do you prefer one or the other? You may be able to have a preference in one direction, and we will be able to eliminate one of these moving forward if that is helpful.
Absolutely. Nick, you hit the nail on the head. I think an important part of this is the incremental nature of the phased approach. We would be, theoretically, the city would be agreeing to take a certain level of responsibility in the funding of maintenance, and then potentially that could ramp up over time. And in that time, the city could find new sources of revenue alter the way that the program is funded. Whereas the grant program, like Nick said, is an application period of one-off approvals for certain funding levels.
And does anyone from the city know how much we would initially put in this grant program?
Matt?
I'll take that. I think undetermined at this point. I guess all we can do is give you a comparison of what the Beautify Your Neighborhood amount is and the facade program. So Matt, what are those amounts annually?
Well, I think the Beautify Your Neighborhood is $5,000 and a $30,000 appropriation, and the facade was $15,000 per grant. And I don't recall what the appropriation was on that. I think the question with the grant program would be what would be the cost of the repairs that we're interested in funding, and how many of those would be interested in funding per year. So there are 46 basins and they need something every 15 years. We should do 3 a year. If that costs $10,000, we're looking at a $15,000 grant in order to be able to get to that in that time period. So I think we'd sit down and start to do those types of calculations to determine what an appropriate level of funding would be. And then if that cap is higher than we're comfortable, then we would obviously not be able to fund everything. And we'd have to look at reducing the grant either in percentage terms or in what our scope is in order to stick within the appropriation.
Okay, thanks, Matt. But it seems to me, Nick, if when we go to city council with our recommendation, and if we say grants the way we want to go, we should have that dollar amount, don't you think? Because then that'd just be the next takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely. We just, what we wanted to provide you here today was just sort of, here are your options.
Okay.
If you choose to go in a very specific direction tonight, that's great. And we will come back. We will spend the time between now and our next meeting putting together a very specific recommendation for you all based on all of the guidance and feedback that you provide us. But if you have a few different options, which it's starting to look like you might, and that's absolutely fine. I think that's appropriate, especially in this sort of challenging discussion that we have here. We'll come back to you and say, this is what a grant program would look like based on some of the research that we're finding. This is what a stormwater utility approach this is what the implication will be, and this is what it'll mean. This is what, I mean, number one would be easy. We say, we're going to take on the maintenance and here's how much we project it's going to cost. But we'll come back to you with a recommendation that includes some of that assessment and research specific to those particular items. But Matt, I think is pretty spot on in saying that would be the approach that we would take in figuring out those dollar amounts. Is what are our current grant programs? What do those look like? How did they arrive at their funding model? And then what is our approach based on what we know in stormwater, based on how many HOAs we're hearing from, how regular we see the typical significant maintenance issues that we would look to address with this program. How regularly does that happen? How many do we have out there? And then how do we back into a number that makes sense for that program?
Yeah, Steve, this is Tom, and kind of going on what Nick was saying, was that number one is basically what we recommended already, correct? So that's.
I don't think we ever recommended a funding option.
Correct, but we didn't, with no new dedicated funding stream. So we said, take on the 46 and then, but if you wanted us to look at, a funding stream. So one is basically the original recommendation.
Tom, I would agree with that. I think that's a fair statement.
So then it comes down to, all right, so there's really, as Nick said, there, instead of having them go through the machinations of all of these, it's like, okay, establishing a stormwater utility fee, you've done a lot of the stuff so far, so I don't think there's much more to do there. I don't think there's much of an appetite for and I agree. I mean, that's an extremely tough one to do. So then you get to the next logical one is the grant program. So you're looking at the 46. You're not taking all 46 on. It's a competitive grant program, but you're accomplishing what you're setting out to do, and that's, hey, those 46 are going to be taken care of eventually, as long as the money is there. If it isn't, well, then go back to the drawing board. Then you ultimately get to number 6, which is, and I don't really, it's like what Jim said, I don't like do nothing. It's basically you're going to go back to status quo.
Right, that's what I think.
Yeah, so where it's the 46, well, it stays as it is. And then the recommendation that we would make to council is, hey, what we recommended in February, never mind. We've looked at all of these other options. Here's the way it is, or you can go, then we go back. But
I agree with everything.
in the essence of time and staff's time is that number 1 doesn't take anything additional to do. Number 3, I don't really want staff to do any more with that, because listening to council, I just don't think the appetite is there to implement that. That would be a Herculean task anyway. It's probably from the practical standpoint, that's probably the best option to go, but the least palatable. I mean, nobody wants to do that, especially now. And then you get into the grant program, which Kirby, great job in researching that. That's probably the most viable. And then we go from there. But with the grant program, it's, going to make Matt do some more work about, and Paul too. I don't know what an appropriate number would be. I know with the beautification grant, some years there's a lot of applications, and other years there's not. It just depends. It would be the same thing with this one. I think it would take a couple of years for HOAs to figure out, oh, okay. And then I think that, Dee, to your point, I think and Elizabeth said the same thing too. There's got to be some guardrails here and some pretty strict ones. And the idea would be with the grant program to bigger projects. Weed whacking some of the weeds along the thing. No, to Jim's point too. I mean, some of that stuff, it's just a Saturday morning, a couple hours, and you can knock that stuff out. It's the, removing silt and things like that. The bigger items those are expensive. And if there were a matching grant, and it does need to be a matching grant, and I like the 50%, there's got to be skin in the game. If they're serious about doing it, then fine.
Hey, Tom, I agree with everything you said, except, and maybe I'm confused on number 1, because my recollection was we went back, we said, here's what it would cost to take on the 46 basins. But no time did we say, here's how you should fund it. And that was to be the takeaway. If the council wants to look at it, then we will look at it. That was my recollection. I didn't believe we went in with that recommendation.
I can clarify. So in essence, it is the antithesis of what you essentially did not recommend, which was, you said, we think it is beneficial and important to consider assuming the maintenance of these 46 basins, but do not do it unless you identify some way of funding this that is not the current structure of just assuming them and paying for it. So that would be the option which you in essence said to council, we do not recommend not identifying a different funding source. Is that helpful?
I'm not sure.
Or is that a confusing way of describing it?
I guess I just had my understanding. That's fine. But everything Tom said, I mean, I agree with. I think what Tom's saying is, that we want to look at the grant program in further detail. Right. I like the grant program, I like the shared risk or the shared benefit, and them having the HOAs having skin in the game. I agree. I don't think the stormwater utility, just based on the work, along with it being viewed as a new tax in this environment today, that anybody would want to even take step one there. Anyone else have other comments?
Taking everything off except the 46 that was recommended to City Council originally, the stormwater utility does not make sense. So yes, I would agree to take that off. The grant program really does. My question about that is we made a recommendation to address those 46. We can limit it to that. What happens if some HOA that has some other issue comes into the grant program and asks to submit a grant for that? Is that something we want? Is that something we need to address, or do we just simply confine it to those 46?
We're still just sort of having a hard time hearing you, but let me see if I can clarify, and you can just let me know if I'm doing a good job or not. Are you asking that, let's say, we created a grant program, and with the idea that it's there to help these 46 basins that are publicly owned, privately maintained, but Diane out in whatever neighborhood, her HOA is a privately owned, privately maintained, and they run into an issue that they did not anticipate. Would they be able to apply to that grant program and receive matched funding as well? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
So I think that's some, Matt, you can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm misstepping here from a sort of financial standpoint, but I would think that that's up to you all in shaping sort of what our recommended parameters would be for a grant program. So you could allow it to be for any stormwater retention basin within the city, as long as it's residential. Or you could say for any stormwater basin, someone could come forward. But then the things that you would need to consider is we start to get into talking about, well, what's the appropriate cap for this bucket of funding? When we first were talking about it, we were talking, okay, we can get a number from there because we know there's 46 of these basins, and here's how regularly we tend to see a major maintenance project take place. Well, now, instead of 46, maybe we're talking, I think, like 150 or something like that or something. So then you start to, that would just be something we would want to consider and talk through before it were something that we committed to. But I think the other thing that's possible is, I think one of the approaches that the commission can take is in saying we recommend the creation of a stormwater grant program pilot, and we'll reassess the pilot program and its success after 2 years. And that can give you the opportunity to take a step back and say, okay, here were the successes, and here's where we saw it do really positive things for the community. Here were some situations where we had a neighborhood come and say, somehow we have a private, and we really needed help and couldn't get help through this grant program because it was too restrictive. Well, that would be an opportunity for the commission in their reassessment to say, okay, well, should we consider expanding the program based on its successes or the challenges or so forth? So I think you even have some options there in how we get creative if this were the direction that you were to head.
I agree with everything you said, Nick. I think that's exactly what I was thinking. We don't want to, I think private has to be excluded. That was never in our scope. And I think to add them now as part of the funding, I think we're just, we're expanding our scope at a late date, and a lot of unknowns. There's going to take a lot of data gathering. I like Nick's approach. Let's get this going. If that's what we want the grant for, the 46 in scope, and then we can look year or two out at expanding it. Okay, does anyone have any feelings or discussion, for beyond the grant program that we want the city to do further research in?
Hey, Steve, and just to the one point that I mentioned about the volunteer ownership group. And I understand, Tom, your perspective there about the weed whacking and such. But from that EPA document that was given, I think, Steve, you may have referenced it, there were certain items there that the HOA receives as far as guidance to maintain their ponds and such. A lot of that stuff, it seemed, I know, like keeping the area clear on the bank was part of it, but it seemed like removal of the debris and such. It did seem like a manageable project on an annual basis. The silt removal was more like a 3 to 7 year time frame. So I was wondering, what are the other major projects that these HOA people are encountering right now? Are they the structural, like disrepair of the drains themselves that are falling apart? I was just wondering what something who was a volunteer would not be able to do. I was just curious.
This is Paul Hammersmith. Probably another good example would be, if you go back to our presentations in Stormwater 101, would be the outlet control structures, which are reinforced concrete or precast concrete. If they would start to deteriorate and need to be replaced, that would be a significant capital cost and not something that your typical resident could take on. If you had a pipe failure, a head wall failure coming into the basin, probably another good example. So those sort of structural elements probably would be also considered because it's a major capital expenditure.
So it's the cost, the monthly fees for HOA fees aren't related to sort of the simple maintenance things. They're not like the hourly costs of maintaining. It's more, you're paying a monthly fee because there's going to come a time where you're going to have to pay a large amount of capital improvement dollars. Is that kind of what is like an insurance policy?
I think it's actually both. I think it's both the routine maintenance and mowing and the HOA fees, and then building a reserve for the capital cost. You know, just as if they had, you know, privately maintained pavement areas, they would do the same thing. They would do the routine annual maintenance, and then they would be reserving funds for that major capital cost of resurfacing, for instance.
I got you. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Besides grant program, commission members, what other options would you like the city to pursue?
I think the grant program is good enough. I think we kind of gone with other stuff anyway. Should be fine.
Elizabeth, you have any thoughts?
I just wanted to ask Matt, I thought I heard you say the number one and possibly the grant program could be partners. This could help fund that piece of it. I remember you combining two could kind of be partners with each other.
The funding source for the grant program and the funding source for not absorbing any new dedicated revenue stream would be the same.
Okay.
I think maybe that's what I was referring to, that they both come out of income tax dollars. The difference would just be the magnitude of the annual ask. Under one would be whatever is the need is, 100% of the need. And under the grant program, you could control the appropriation through the grant itself.
And I guess after listening to this, and we talked a lot about this, and I know the commission members who preceded us talked a lot about this. What is the pressing need to reevaluate this? Are there neighborhoods that are just completely like that giant carp that was stuck in the pipe for a while and had to go get fished out literally? Or the fact that you do have to maintain the silt factor and, you know, possibly do a pretty big dredge? What's the impetus or what's the problem we're trying to solve with revisiting the wastewater?
Paul, are you able to speak just toward a little bit toward, since you all are sort of the ones that hear a lot of these requests and are interacting with these neighborhoods, would you be able to speak toward how regularly you're hearing these things?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, Elizabeth, because we had that same discussion kind of at staff level. Because, you know, probably maybe 2 years ago, we were hearing from a select few HOAs about concerns about maintaining their basins. But we did say probably in the last 18 months, and certainly within the last year since you've been having these discussions, we haven't heard from any of them. And there hasn't really been an outcry saying that, hey, we need assistance. So I think that's another nice element of the grant program is we're going to figure out what the need is out there through those requests. And if it's something that the HOAs are really truly interested in and need assistance with. Because right now I think it's somewhat of a question mark for us on staff too. So I think that's a fair point.
I just don't want to have the staff to have to put a ton of effort into all of these options if it really isn't a problem we need to solve, or that Dublin is experiencing massive HOA questions. And I just think, we spent a lot of time tonight talking about it. We spent a lot of time in the past. Our predecessor spent a lot of time. Is it worthy of continuing this conversation? Or, to your point, Paul, put in a grant program or a pilot program to see if it is required, or at least have that guardrail to say, yes, we have evaluated this.
Yeah, I think those are all good points. And I think that's part of what goes back to the stormwater utility discussion. I mean, certainly staff's in favor of and not dispensing with a stormwater utility, but is it really worth pursuing that over 46 basins? We feel like there's a much greater need out there to demonstrate why a stormwater utility is an appropriate funding mechanism for stormwater management as a whole, community-wide, not just for 46 basins, that we're not really sure what the need is and the outcry is from the HOAs.
So Steve, does that help get us moving this plane forward?
I think so. Anyone else have any comments? I was just trying to find Marilyn's presentation that she made, and I couldn't find it to the council in February, because the presentation had what the needs were, why we were doing this. So, I don't want to think that we had no need and we're just doing this haphazardly.
Yep. I don't think there's a difference between need as far as what the required maintenance is.
Mm-hmm.
By need, I'm saying we're not hearing directly from the HOAs as far as them coming forward saying, hey, city, please help us with this. We're overburdened. We don't have sufficient funds to do this.
Okay. So besides the grant program, anyone else have any comments? Otherwise, we'll go with that. Okay.
Sorry, Steve, I wanted to add one other thing here too, which, as we think about what the recommendation to council would be, and I think, as staff, we'll come back to you with if the grant is the direction that the commission wants to head, which it appears that it is, we'll come back to you with a sort of more well thought out and framed actual program and what generally that would look like, so that your recommendation is sort of robust and specified for city council. But I think I've heard, Paul just spoke to it, and I've heard others sort of talk about stormwater utility. We recognize and we think it's a good long-term pursuit for the city when we think about our overarching and overall stormwater funding needs as we continue to assume more maintenance and have ongoing costs and things that we need to anticipate as the city ages and looks to maintain and take care of their stormwater. I think it's perfectly acceptable if the commission wants to make a statement in your recommendation or memo to council as we advance that, to say, we also discussed stormwater utilities and the benefits of issuing or exploring a stormwater utility fee, and think it's a worthwhile consideration for council to consider the exploration of stormwater utility fee long term. So in saying that we don't believe it's appropriate for the specific issue, but we do think that it could be something that would be worth taking time to consider long term, I think is something that you could integrate into a recommendation as well. I just don't want those of the commission members that have felt like that could be a viable option to feel like that's lost in this discussion or in this recommendation as we think about our recommendation, or you think about your recommendation to city council.
And I think that's well said by Nick. I think that's a very good point. That again, we're not discarding it entirely, but you're somewhat discarding it just for this issue of these 46 basins.
Okay, well taken. Is there anything specific besides, getting structure around this grant program that we want the city to look at in the next month before we meet again? Okay.
I just think the fact that we have two other type of grant programs and the HOAs are definitely involved in some of those already. So adding an additional grant capability for the HOAs, I think really fits the bill for the 46 that might need some additional help. So I think it's a all around good way to go.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to close this topic, and the agenda was future projects or activities for CSAC. Did you put anything together, Nick, or is this just an open discussion?
Steve, this would just be an open discussion. I think what you all could do here, and I know this is something that we've done previously, and then a pandemic happened and we missed a couple meetings, and life has been confusing and difficult for all of us. But I think it would be perfectly appropriate for the commission. You have some time here to have a discussion about your areas of interest. We've also added a couple of new members since that point. Areas of interest, areas you'd like to be focused, things that you've worked on or interested in working on, and advance to council and say, hey, we're finishing up a topic here with stormwater management and the funding of these basins. We do not have any other impending topics currently. Here are some areas that we're interested in. Do you have anything specific that you want us working on, or are there things that we can be pursuing or contributing to with our expertise here as the Community Services Advisory Commission? So, I think you have 15 minutes here to have some discussion about areas of interest. And Steve, I know you had asked for this to be added, and so I think it's a good time to take an opportunity to do that.
So at our March, I realized Gary and Jim weren't there. Dee was. At our March meeting, we did go over a list. Is in the March meeting minutes. A few topics that we could talk or further explore as a commission. But this is definitely not an all-inclusive list, nor is it the list we need to follow. So the ideas were I'm going to throw some starters here. Going over how the city, the city's disaster recovery methodologies and how they're prepared for disaster recovery. This all came up, and then the pandemic came up, so it's kind of timely. Another one was about maybe making our parks more friendly for disabled people. Another item, which is in our charter as a group, was to look at the master plan for parks and recreation and see how it should be updated. I'm just going through the March meeting minutes. Talked about Wi-Fi, citywide Wi-Fi, what the status is. Talked about city fee structures and, that's what I talked about, to better understand how our city, charges the different fees to the different entities. And then the last one was, where we stood for the residential trash and recycling RFP, and would we be able to look at that and have input into it. For the newbies on the commission, when I'm not even sure, it's probably over a year ago, the city did another RFP or request for a quote for residential trash and recycling pickup. We had the opportunity to go through the RFP, give our feedback, and it was I thought it was a really good opportunity for us to really understand. And then you know, we made a presentation to city council. They did not accept our recommendations, and because they ended up being they were like best in class, but they were very expensive at the same time. So the city, as I recall, Nick, we had elected to just go. They had an opportunity to go another year on the existing contract.
Yeah, so we had an option to simply add another year to the contract. The most significant challenge that we run into when it comes to trash and recycling contract is we only had one person complete our RFP last year, which was Rumpke, and so, or the previous cycle was Rumpke, and so it's not a very saturated, and there's many reasons for that. If you recall, you know, the way that it's district or sort of portioned out across Central Ohio, it's consortium based. So, you know, we share our service area, and so there's a lot of components to that. But let me do some follow up on my end on that one,
Okay.
and I'll touch base with Michael Darling, who oversees our contract, and see where everything is at with that, and if there's opportunity either for the commission to provide additional review or at least receive a quick update. I think that would be absolutely appropriate. I wanted to hit on at least two of the other ones that you had mentioned, just simply because I think if the rest of the commission is interested, I can absolutely coordinate with staff and provide you know, a presentation and a general maybe discussion around emergency management. Obviously would be a really interesting one for you all. And we have a pretty robust plan in place internally, and it might be an interesting opportunity for our emergency management point of contact, Tom Hershey, to sort of walk through what that's been like, you know, as we sort of went through a pandemic. And ours wasn't, we did have an influenza emergency management plan, but it wasn't, you know, there were some things where obviously that applied, but there were definitely areas where it was very different. And how do we react and sort of cope with all the things all the implications that come with that. So, you know, I think that would certainly be something interesting. And, you know, I would imagine that we would be looking to update our emergency management plan now that we've been through this, and would anticipate that we need to maybe be a little bit more open-minded about what are the biggest, you know, disasters that we should be anticipating and facing as a community. And so that, I think, is a good area of interest. And then the other one that I can talk to Doug McCullough, the city's chief information officer, and ask him about some of the Wi-Fi and connected projects that the city has been working on. Obviously, as many of you, I'm sure, probably know, that's a big area of interest for city council, and a goal of theirs is to be the most connected community in the country. And so we obviously have a lot of different projects and things going on in that. So, you know, I think that's a good thing to say to council, hey, we're interested in working on that. I don't know, I can't promise that you will get any projects within that, because I know it's something that they're all interested in as well. So, you know, it's their thing, so they like being involved with it quite a bit. But, you know, I think that would be a good one to say to council, to say, hey, we're interested in this too. Is there something that we could contribute to or work on to assist with that as well? So I can work with staff and see if they'd be, at the very least, be willing to provide some updates on what's happening in the city with those specific projects in those areas. And so I wanted to throw those couple out because those sort of popped for me. And I'll do some follow up on the trash recycling contract as well.
And what about sustainability? I didn't bring that one up, but we spent a lot of time as a commission working on the prior policy, or I should say the program. Is there any updates coming out of that we should be involved in or looking at?
So obviously with the sustainability stuff, that's something near and dear to me, and that I work on specifically with J.M. Rayburn, who many of you have met and received presentation from. we were supposed to be meeting this year, and things have stalled a little bit. That's more on my end more than anything else. I just, things have been a little bit busy. So I've been working on that recently. My plan currently with external advisory team that we have in place and our internal team that we have in place is to work to create a second iteration of a sustainability framework, just like we did with the previous one. We would absolutely look to bring that to the commission to get feedback from you all on as well. It might not be quite as robust of the process that we had last time. If you remember the last time that those of you that were on the commission that worked on it, oh man, I think it's only like a few of you now, but I'm not saying that you've been on the commission for forever or anything like that, but we spent, I think, close to a year going through that and hearing from staff about everything that the city does and where we want to focus. So I think we would look to maybe bring one presentation to you to give you an idea of what we've been working on, and then maybe give you a meeting in between to provide some feedback on the document, and then maybe touch on it at a second meeting type deal, because we have this external group that's working on some things, and we'll continue to work on them here into the next year. So, but that was a long way of saying we'll probably look to bring you something within 2021 for some review. So
Okay.
we would absolutely love to have the commission's feedback and thoughts on it.
So for our newbies, just want to remind you that not only can we take work or receive work requests from city council to work on, like we have for the stormwater, we also have the right to present ideas that we want to work on as a commission. And we can't just do it, but once they approve it, then, city would devote staff to help us solve whatever we want to solve or create something new. So we have that option. So that was my point about putting this on the agenda. So we don't get to a point where we don't have work or something to work on. I think it's more fun doing something than just sitting there waiting for something to occur. So I suggest we keep this on our agenda for next meeting, and that Jim, Dee, and Gary and everyone could think about, and Vivek, who kind of our newbies, what's things that you're interested in, because it's really it's a green field. We could do, as long as we as a commission agree, we could present whatever we want to city council on things that we feel we should devote our time and energies to. So I think,
Steve?
Yes, Jim?
Do we have a moment? Because I did want to just toss one out to
Sure.
see, get your opinion. It ties into what you referenced from your list, which was like the parks and recreation, which is a big interest of mine as well. And the whole idea around making some of these areas that are right now simply just parking lots, like underneath the Emerald Parkway Bridge, make them more than that, where you could actually educate the kids and parents that come down to the riverfront there to show them the different species of fish that are in the water, or the bird, the herons, and have pictures. You see them in some of those parks, but I just want to toss that out. I don't know if that's in our area.
Sure.
Or if it's another area it covers. I just want to toss it out because it kind of goes to the connectivity to the community as well, because you could really make some fun things out of that with the social media and stuff.
Well, that's definitely us, because our commission grew from bringing together several commissions over the years, but a primary one was Parks and Rec. So that is, our major foundation is from Parks and Rec as a commission. So it's definitely within the scope.
Yeah, and Jim and Gary, for your benefit, that was one of the areas I know that was discussed previously when we went through this process. I had touched base with our director of Parks and Recreation, Matt Ehrman, and I actually met, and he invited me to just sort of chat with their sort of leadership team within Parks and Recreation to just talk about some of the areas that I think you all identified of interest maybe back when we did this process maybe a year ago. And I think they would have interest in maybe coming to the commission and having a discussion, because I think Jim, one of the things that you mentioned, I think it'd be interesting to hear from them why some parks look the way they do, and why Some don't have, the level of development or programming that you would maybe expect them to have quite yet. And so just maybe even then talking through their master plan or their strategic plan long-term and what that looks like. And then I can check and see if there's an opportunity and if they're looking to get feedback on any, long-term, long-range plans that they have that maybe they're looking for review. This body could be a good place for them to get some feedback on that as well. So that's another one that I'll take
Great.
back.
Thank you.
I recall, Jim, you mentioned fishing the last time. You do some fishing in the stormwater basins. And I was thinking maybe we could charge you a fishing license fee to help pay for some of the stormwater basins.
I'm probably a pretty big user there. More than my share.
So
Okay.
for our next meeting, everyone think about, activities you'd like to see us work on so we could, create a robust list. As we're running out of time.
Just can I have a quick minute? Then Nick already brought it up on on the emergency management, and really, if you can, when they bring it up, like the Restart Ohio. So I wanted, if you have any presentation regarding that, that would be nice. So we can, something that we can learn about it. And the things are going to be changed for a short time, at least 3 to 4 years, probably how we can do business differently than normal. Just thought it'd be fine.
Okay. So our last topic, is there any other items of interest outside of anything we talked about? If not, I'd like to thank the city for, consolidating those literally hundreds of pages of information they gave us into 15 or so slides.
Yeah.
It was really helpful, and I'm glad we came to at least a path forward. So thank you, city, and thank you, commission.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, we're going to adjourn our meeting. Meeting adjourned. Bang with my gavel.
Thank you
See y'all.
Okay, have a
Thank
good
you.
week, month, and we'll see you September 8th, 6:30.
Very good.
Thanks.
We'll be here.
Sounds
Okay,
good.
thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Marjorie. And Cindy and Kirby.